Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining APQC's webinar 2021 What's Ahead for Process and Performance Management. As a reminder, audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are muted. This is the Q&A tool located on the right of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them here and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording in a few days. I would now like to take a moment to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, APQC's Process and Performance Management Principal Research Lead, Holly Lyke-Ho-Gland.
All right, thank you, Madison, and thank you all for joining us for our annual Process and Performance Management Priorities webinar. That takes a look at kind of what are the big challenges, as well as kind of looking for what to expect for this year. So like I said, it's where we really kind of dig into what are the trends and challenges impacting process and performance management professionals. What's important to you, as well as what's really impeding the effectiveness of your work. Now, so how do we do this here at APQC is that every year we conduct an annual survey to understand those common challenges and priorities of practitioners and kind of the top 5 key topic areas in this place called process and performance management. There's 2 reasons we conduct this survey, and the first is because these inputs are incredibly important in driving our annual research agenda. But the second reason is we also want to provide an opportunity for people to connect and understand what are the common challenges people are facing and where that aligns with some of the work that you're doing. So today we're going to discuss the findings from the research, particularly digging into the what's important. So what are those key challenges? How can we address some of those challenges by looking at tips and resources that are already available to talk about, to kind of address them. And then we also always include some additional topics, some special interest areas and places that we're kind of looking at potentially doing research on. And this year we are looking at corporate culture and sustainability. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with what can you expect in 2021? So what is the research that we have planned this year? All right, so to dive in, the first thing I want to kind of take a look at is what are the big priority areas for process and performance management this year. And as you can see, they're really still kind of focused on those key competencies. So business process management and continuous improvement in the process side of the house, and data analytics and measurement when we're talking on the performance side. So these are the 4 topics that have floated up to the top for the last couple of years as far as those key areas of interest. Now we're going to kind of spend our time today talking about those 4, but the rest of these topic areas you can also find additional information on the final survey summary report, and we'll make sure that there's a link embedded in the follow-up email for you guys to take a look at those as well. So what I really want to do then is just kind of get started then on the process management side. So what are the big challenges and the trends in business process management and continuous improvement? So you can see the 3 challenges for both here on the screen. So if you look at the left-hand side, we're really talking about those BPM challenges. And organizations continue to stress things like end-to-end mapping, looking for accountability and ownership through governance, and managing process performance through thoughtful measures. Now, when we talk about defining and mapping end-to-ends, this has been a topic area that has grown in importance over the last 3 years. There's a lot of reasons behind that. We know that end-to-end processes help organizations connect what they do to customer value. It helps us improve handoffs between departments, and also helps set it up so we can account for changes that we make in one process and look and make sure it's not going to negatively impact steps further downstream. Now, technology has also been another huge driver for why end-to-ends are so important. Things like ERPs, some BPM suites, as well as even some of our automation suites are already coming with pre-built end-to-ends in them. So organizations really want to take a look at it and get a handle on their end-to-ends so that they can stay competitive. Now, where do organizations get hung up when we're talking about end-to-end? Quite a few different places. And the first place most organizations struggle is with figuring out which one to start with. So there's a lot of end-to-end processes out there, and we need to be able to prioritize which ones are most important for the organization's goals and what it's working on at this time. Defining the scope of the process is kind of number two. There's also a lot of variations of end-to-end out there. So how do we determine where our end-to-end process begins and ends? And then the other kind of big challenges are similar to what we see right here on the screen. Identifying governance. How do we pick end-to-end owners, process owners, particularly because they tend to span departments? And then how do we pick the best KPIs then to manage those end-to-end processes as well? So then that goes into that kind of picking the right KPIs for process. In the research we did recently, we were looking at BPM programs. And what we found is that this idea of performance measures and managing process performance is probably the biggest gap of BPM teams. Unfortunately, a lot of what we call the performance process performance tenet is pretty reactive and ad hoc. A lot of organizations only monitor some processes, or they do it in an ad hoc reactive manner. When they pick the KPIs, they tend to do them also in an ad hoc, sometimes relying on what we've always measured or something along those lines. And then their control points tend to be also incredibly siloed. But process teams really are struggling with this idea of best fit measures for the work that they do. And that really has us asking a lot of additional questions, such as, so what is the right measure for our process? Should we focus on productivity measures? If so, which type of productivity measures should we work on? Do we need to identify this process's alignment to business value? And how would we measure that as well? What is the right kind of KPI there? And again, we'll talk about some of the solutions as we get into this a little bit more. And that third challenge for BPM teams is really looking at establishing governance. Governance is incredibly important to helping us build process work into the business and creating accountability. But we have a lot of hard time identifying the right people and getting buy-in on providing governance roles from the business side. And a lot of times is, should it be a role or should it be a person, is one of the questions we hear a lot. Also, how do we go about showing the value of the processes so that we can get buy-in and get people to volunteer to take this extra work on their already full plate? So those are kind of the big three BPM challenges. And you can see here on the right-hand side, what are the continuous improvement challenges? And these are actually remained pretty steady over the last couple of years. Really, it's because continuous improvement tends to be stymied by a couple of things. We don't have criteria and structure. We have a lot of operational silos that make doing this work very, very hard. And we also have to find a way to get our employees empowered and on top of it and building in that mindset and that culture to think continuous improvement. So like I said, with identifying, prioritizing, and selecting opportunities, it's a lot of how do we go about becoming proactive with opportunities for improvement? How do we make sure that we're fixing what's important, not just what gets pushed to the front? And how do we make sure this isn't going to cause problems in other areas if we fix it? On top of that, especially as we talk about the environment we're in now, it's how do we objectively apply limited resources to the most vital problems? And the second one there, that creating a continuous improvement culture, has also been a long-term challenge. And that's really how do we go about what kind of measures, what tactics do we need to do so that we make sure employees have the tools, the skills, and the decision rights to identify improvements in the flow of work, which really helps us then create an organic culture that is always looking for ways to improve the execution of work and looking through that process lens. And then the last one there, which is actually the new one this year, is aligning improvement efforts across the organization. So again, how do we break down that silo approach and apply an enterprise-wide view that has consistency and can able to see how all the moving parts fit together? So again, there's been, for the most part, the challenges this year are very similar to what they were last year. There's been, like I said, a couple of little differences. That organization-wide perspective for CI is definitely new, and picking the right KPIs for process work is the new one here on the business process management side. So the next question is, so how can we address some of these? What are some of the tips and challenges or tips that we have for addressing them? All right, so starting off with kind of that end-to-end idea is, so what we really see is that best practice organizations kind of applied a few different things to tackle some of those end-to-end challenges. And the first one is really then identifying some criteria to prioritize, which ones to tackle first. So going about looking at things like complexity, impact, and alignment to the organization's goals to really then help drive which ones we should focus on first. And another part of it then is also looking for the scope is seeing what's out there already. There's a lot of end-to-end processes out there. We've got a handful here at APQC as well, and that can help just give you a starting point as far as figuring what's in and what's out. But the real kind of crux for developing end-to-ends is because it also has to be adopted, and you also have to engage the business. Now, a really good example that I've seen for how to do this is with Vanguard. They developed a very structured approach to help engage the business in value stream mapping and their end-to-end development and improvement identification. So what they did was they had two teams. So they had their process team, which came from the lean office, which was usually about 2 or 3 people. And then they would have approximately about a 10-person team from the business who worked with them to help develop a specific end-to-end process. Now, the business side of the house roles included some strategic roles. So they had a sponsor, they had a champion. They also then had somebody who was working hand in hand for the facilitation, the project management side with the lean team. But they also then included a bunch of SMEs to help provide those insights. One of the unique things I found about their kind of mix of SMEs is they also used a technology team member, because a lot of the times these end-to-ends are going to tie into data or some form of technology. They have that individual there to help address those potentials, and as well as help figure out the best way to build it forward. They also had a legal and compliance team member there who was responsible for ensuring that any of the process changes they made as they were developing these end-to-ends would be in compliance with any of the relevant regulations. So they kind of had a 3-stage approach to how they kind of set about working with the business to do this. And the first one is preparation. And it's kind of like our typical is gather everything that's already there. So they pulled together all the current states for the processes that were probably going to be in that end-to-end. They looked at the RACEs, they looked at the SIPOCs, they collected key data, because again, part of theirs was also looking for improvements while they were building them. So looking at delay times, accuracy, lead times. And they brought all of that in to help identify what is the business goal, what are some potential pain points, and here's all the pieces that we need to potentially put together to fit this end-to-end process. So then they would do a several-day workshop with the stakeholders to help identify, so taking those pieces of the puzzle we have and putting them together to figure out what the actual end-to-end currently looks like. And then kind of looking for those waste points and developing, going through Gemba walks and the rest of it to identify, so this is what it actually will look like once we finalize and execute our to-be state for the end-to-end process. And then the implementation is that last step. And they would usually hand that over to ownership by the business. So that's why that team composition for them was so important, because they needed the business to own it and to implement it and be responsible for it after the development. Now, the second kind of tip here is to create structures for performance and improvements. A lot of organizations, like I said, struggle with measures. Unfortunately, measurement is the first step to having those very structured management systems for your processes and to look for improvements. So organizations really need to start by identifying those KPIs and then kind of use a traditional portfolio management approach to their improvement efforts. Develop a business case, put it against each, get a series of business cases together, stack them against clear criteria for how we want to identify what needs to go in and go out, using a steering committee to help make those decisions, and then putting it and assigning resources that way. The last challenge then was really looking at that governance. And one of the things that we found is that organizations actually need to balance strategic and tactical governance. So process governance, like I said, is vital. It helps us make things actionable, and it helps embed it in the business. Now, this has been an ongoing challenge for a few years, but I'm happy to say that I have seen some headway for a lot of organizations. And that same research we did on BPM programs, what we found is that most organizations, like 77% of them, said they have process owners. They may not have process owners for all their processes, but they do have process owners. Now, the downside to that is that process owners tend to be a fairly tactical approach. Only about a third of organizations are actually incorporating strategic governance. And that's in the form of sponsors or a steering committee and all those groups that help us understand how the work aligns with organizational strategy, giving us access to all of the resources and technology that we need to improve our processes, and having those kind of high-level advocates for the benefits of process, people who will promote success stories, and help identify and communicate pain points. So there's a lot of different ways people can go about that, but looking specifically at the criteria that you need as far as governance and finding a way to build in the buy-in for, again, how do we make sure that people are excited about it and willing to take on this extra work? And that leads us to the other side of the process and performance. So looking at performance management and the big challenges there. One clarification I always like to make at this point, when we're talking about performance management, we're not talking about people performance. We're talking about organizational performance. So that is looking at the execution of our processes, not the individuals who do them, as well as our ability to execute strategic goals and work for the organization. Like I said, it's just a minor clarification that I got to put out there every once in a while. So as I said when we looked earlier, the big two challenges on the performance side is measurement and data and analytics. And you can see the measurement ones here on the left. And again, what we're kind of looking at is we're really still struggling with the foundational elements of measurement when we're talking about performance. Looking at identifying the right mix of measures is really what's encompassed in those top two challenges that we have there. Looking at leading and lagging and in-process measures are really important because it helps us with performance controls and as well as not being reactive to problems in the processes. So by identifying those leading measures, we're able to see things before they become problematic. And the need to incorporate non-financial measures is also very, very vital because financial measures tend to be lagging measures and they don't help us always understand what's going on. Because financial measures are so many far steps removed from the process, it requires a lot more digging in and root cause analysis before we can get to the actual problem, if we're able to at all. And it's also usually not enough to help us really drive change. So again, that mix of measures is super important and one that we tend to struggle with. I know sometimes organizations fall into the trap of measuring what's easy or what's familiar, but instead it's a matter of taking that step back to figure out what drives decisions and what helps us really understand how work is going. And then that last challenge here for measurement is looking at consistent use of performance measures across the organization. So again, similar to what we saw on the process side of the house, there's some silo issues going on. And really, how do we break out of those silos to understand what is the big picture performance? By using consistent measures across business lines, business units for the same types of measures or data that we're trying to understand is incredibly important to help us set up our ability to do what's on the right-hand side. Consistent measures are vital for us to be able to do effective data and analytics. So as far as looking at what's changed from last year to this year, previously, really, we saw a lot of information on a measurement culture or a performance culture. And that hasn't been quite as good. And really, it's more about looking at breaking down those silos. So if you look here on the right-hand side, the other aspect of performance management is really looking at that data and analytics. And these have actually been fairly consistent challenges for as long as we've been covering data analytics. Data analytics we started covering, I think, in 2016. And it kind of went to sleep for a little bit. And then it came back with a vengeance in 2019 as one of the major topic areas that PPM folks were really looking at. And there's a lot of different reasons behind that. Some of it is to be with the technology that is behind. A lot of the technology that we adopt has to have a good data and analytics foundation, which ironically also has to have a good performance measurement foundation to work effectively. But the challenge, like I said, have been pretty consistent, establishing that culture of data-driven decision-making. So how do we really go about engaging people so that they will, instead of going and talking to Bob anytime they need to make a specific type of decision, will go and look at the dashboards and see what the indicators show, or get some, analytics done to help look at potentialities. Let's play out some scenarios to see what happens. And that then kind of also, I think, is directly linked then to that establishing a roadmap. And that's really helping us understand, what can we use analytics for? What is it good for? What can't it do? And mapping out what are the important places for us to apply data and analytics teams to. So helping us really then prioritize what are the important decisions that we need to make, and how do we back them up with the right types of analytics. And the last challenge here is one that has come back recently. And really it's this idea of, how do we make sure that when we conduct analytics, we're answering the right questions, as well as making sure that the data makes sense. So, and this is not really kind of a new concept for anybody who's done anything in reporting, right? As we know, anytime we've done reporting work, we need to be able to understand, what are the right questions to ask? How do we make sure we answer them? And what is the storytelling we have to put around it, and the context we have to put around it, so that the data makes sense? So these are kind of, again, these are really just the big top 3 challenges across both of these areas. And like I said, we've seen a lot of consistency from this year to next. But let's take a look at some of the solutions that we've seen as well. The first one here is getting that right mix, right? So if we don't understand what are the right measures and have a good solid mix of measures to make decisions off of, we really cannot do much with the other pieces. And so there's a lot of kind of key areas that organizations can use to help identify and get the right mix. And the first is really, one of the easy ways is looking at industry standards, or looking at benchmarks to help start developing ideas on what are the right measures for the processes or the business work that we're trying to do. And the second is really making sure you have a solid selection criteria. So how do we go about making sure that we are assessing measures against what we need? You can use selection criteria. I also think there's a couple of simple questions that you can ask when you're working with your stakeholders, usually in a workshop, to help make sure you're pinpointing and using the right measures to assess each of the processes or the business work. And the first one is this idea of organizational goals, right? Asking yourself, does this process need, or is a specific measure one that is aligned? Is it strategic in nature? Is it linked to a strategic objective? Can we use it to connect to the business value of what we're executing? Also, with under that organizational goals, is it related to revenue? Now, financial measures shouldn't be your only measure, but they are often an important measure for decision makers. And the third part about that organizational goals is this something that has an impact or needs a measure associated with customers or employees? And that really helps us understand kind of those value-driven ways we can identify the right measures for the specific area. The other part is really that I think looking at the purpose of each measure or each process. And you start with the questions like, what is the operational purpose of the process? What is it that it's important to us concerning this process? Is it accuracy or quality? Is it speed? Is it really focused on safety or costs? And that then really helps us then incorporate that big question I asked earlier, which is, so what is the right productivity measure then that we want to associate with that process? Because if we're measuring everything, then we have a lot of white noise, unfortunately. So this really helps us hone in on which of those productivity measures is vital. And from there, once you really identify which is the operational purpose, you can dig in. Say it's speed. So then you want to really understand, well, how do you measure the characteristic of speed? Cycle time is usually typically the way that we then go through and identify cycle time measures to if speed's important. And then the next question after that is then, so what's the context, or how do we normalize that data? So if we still take the example of speed, well, how do we measure cycle time? Are we measuring it in days? Are we measuring it in months? Are we measuring it in minutes? And that, again, helps us contextualize what is the right measures. So again, like I said, there's a lot of other ways you can look at industry benchmarks as one way to identify potentials. There's also a lot of methodologies out there like Balanced Scorecard that are great guides to help you identify right mixes that help you look at a lot of different aspects when you're measuring. And the second part was that big idea of a culture, right? Even though performance culture wasn't in the top 5 this year, the data analytics culture has maintained steady. So how do we engage and drive adoption for data analytics? Really, the simple answer is really to kind of take a look at some change management tactics to help us really then engage people in this idea and get their buy-in and get their ultimate adoption. The first one is involve. We have to involve decision makers in the process. And this means by understanding their needs and further improving insights with them through iterative analytical processes where they're part of it. So helping them be part of the decision making in the actual process of analytics. Leveraging peer catalysts. And this is really just a matter of identifying who your natural centers of influence are and who are those people that are super excited about data analytics and what it can do, and working with them to help address issues, work with their peers to help really kind of help identify and drive that value. And the last one is to simply engage employees in the process. There's a lot of ways that we can do this. We can use interactive communication tactics, use focus groups, use employee-led training is another great way of really engaging people in the factor, and using feedback mechanisms. And what all of this does is it helps remove data analytics from that scary thing that nobody really understands to something that people feel they have a sense of control over and investment in getting it right. And then the last part there is about creating structure. Pardon me. So what we've seen really good organizations do is use a collaborative and iterative analytics process. Now, one of the easiest examples that a lot of people use is CRISP-DM. And a lot of people use that because it's an iterative collaborative one that involves conducting analytics in collaboration with the key stakeholders and the decision makers. Now, there's other methodologies out there, but they should all include these 4 kind of phases. And the first one is scoping the project. Now, this is where we start understanding what are the questions the analysis needs to answer. What's the feasibility of conducting the analysis? Is this data we already have, or is this something we have to go find? And then defining the scope and project plan. Now, a lot of this means getting those relevant stakeholders together, right? The business side of the house, our analytics, and our data management teams, and having them have an open discussion to help develop that plan, which helps us identify objectives, data needs. Like I said, is this something we already have data on or not? Methods, what is the appropriate type of analysis we need to conduct, and what does success look like? So, and I know those are very kind of traditional scoping things, but we don't always think about them when we're talking about executing analytics. And that goes into the second part, right? So conduct the analysis. This is really where we start with our data collection, conducting our analysis, and in some cases, building out models. Once we've conducted that initial phase of analysis is when we move into evaluation. And this is unfortunately, I think, one of the key steps that so often gets overlooked when we're doing data and analytics. And this is where the iterative part comes in as well. So in the evaluation stage, we take the initial findings, get back together with all of our stakeholders, including the business, and kind of review them, go through the findings, see if they make sense, see if they answer the questions, and then refine the questions or the analysis type or the models according to whether or not they hit the mark. Now, I think one of the parts about this particular type that a lot of people get frustrated with is that because this can include several iterations to get right. But in the long run, doing this work not only gets you to better answers, it also helps you get buy-in and understanding from your business stakeholders. And then the last part there is deployment. And this is where we then hand over the information and the outcome of the project to address that need at the beginning of the project. So again, these are just kind of some quick tips and solutions for some of those major challenges that we've seen in the process and the performance management aspect. So what I'm going to do at this point is then kind of shift into those kind of special interest topics that I mentioned earlier. We always tend to include what I always call them special interest topics, but really the purpose for them is to help us scope out our research for the year on specific subtopics that we're considering involving in the research. It also gives you guys some comparisons on topics that are of interest to this audience. So this year we really wanted to look at two things: corporate culture and sustainability. So we're going to start here with culture. The first question I always ask about kind of these special interest topics, or what people are curious about, is why this particular topic? Why we picked corporate culture is because it is incredibly pervasive in everything that we do. And especially as organizations are suffering from disruption and change, understanding culture and its impact is incredibly vital. The reason behind that is kind of goes through like how we define culture. So here at APQC, we define culture as the ingrained social norms and beliefs of the organization. It's comprised of things like values, belief systems, leadership styles, collective unspoken assumptions, stories, and rituals, as well as it's the character and the orientation of the organization. So given that it's comprised of so many tangible and intangible elements, it's really not surprising that 96% of the respondents feel that culture is important to the work they do. And this is particularly important for PPM folks because it's both something that is potentially an impediment to the work we do, but also potentially something that we're affecting in the work that we do, whether it's a digital transformation project, a minor process improvement, or even something else. So it's become an incredibly important aspect for us to take into consideration as we execute work. So the second kind of big question we wanted to understand was, so what are the drivers of culture in the organizations? Or in other words, how do we communicate and reinforce the norms and beliefs of the organization? And most of these are probably kind of easy to see, right? So obviously leadership behavior is a big one, especially because leaders embody what we do, what's important, and what you do to succeed. So by looking to leadership's behaviors, their norms, what they find important is a really good way of understanding what is important to the organization, because it's helped them get to the level and progress. The second one there is core values, and this is kind of our top-down push model of what culture is, right? I always like to think of it, it's the poster that you have the little checklist of your norms and behaviors and what's important, right? So it's kind of that organizational design component of culture and how we communicate it. The next two, which are department goals and performance goals, really emphasize that what's important to the organization, right? And looking at that idea of values. What do we value and what is important for us to achieve? Unfortunately, goals is also, I think, one of the stickiest points when we talk to culture, and it's an easy place to break down. And the last one is mission statement, and that's kind of similar to the core values there, right? That is our explicit codification of what the organization stands for and what it values and what it delivers. So the one thing that looking at these and compared to that listing of cultures is that all of these are fairly easy to spot mechanisms for culture, right? They're the kind of the obvious levers that we see. The intangibles are the things that people typically don't think of when they're talking about drivers of culture, and things like mentoring, the rituals that we all do, as far as what do we celebrate as an organization, what do we capture at that point. So again, this is just kind of a look at why culture is important and really what are those levers that most people see as far as how do we manage it and how do we change it. And that brought us to the second question, which was, okay, so we understand the importance of culture. We understand what are the levers people tend to pull for it, but where are people struggling when it comes to culture? And one of the reasons in particular that this became really important to us is we were doing a lot of research around the pandemic. We're having a lot of conversations with people about what's changed and what are their struggles. So we asked the simple question, has the pandemic had an impact on your organization's culture? And 51% of the organization said yes. There has been some aspects of our cultures that are shifted. I would like to possibly think that there's also been maybe some bigger changes as well, but I'll get to that as we kind of walk through these challenges. And the first challenge at the top is this idea of aligning efforts between teams of different subcultures. I don't think this is probably anything new to anybody on this call. What is the biggest sticking point on a lot of the work we do is the collaboration between different teams. Different teams have different goals, they have different ways of working, they have different value systems, and sometimes it's really difficult to get those groups to collaborate effectively. And we've seen these kind of issues all the way back from like 15 years ago when open innovation was the big thing and we had to get marketing and product development, two very different cultures working together to identify new innovative ways of producing products. And that's just kind of one example. I think another great example that another organization mentioned when we were talking about this idea was the getting IT and knowledge management to work together, right? You have two different groups that are both working in the same space, but getting them to collaborate together is very difficult because IT has to worry about, and their focus on goals is a lot about security and making sure to reduce risk. Where knowledge management on the other side, their goal and their purpose is then very focused on transparency and making sure people have access to information. So any kind of collaborative work between those two projects teams makes it very, very difficult, and in finding ways to align that. Like I said, and a lot of times when we started peeling back on this idea of different subcultures, it had to do with team goals and whether or not they were aligned on the similar purpose. So that's an easy breakdown place that we see. And the second one is this idea of shifting cultures to support new business models or needs. And this is where I said I think minor aspects have changed, but really in a lot of ways there's some drastic changes for a lot of organizations. Now, we talked about some of the challenges. What did we see? We saw data analytics, data-driven decision-making culture. We saw continuous improvement culture. We've also all heard organizations wanting to have a digital culture, or an innovative culture, or a learning culture. And then, so again, this makes sense as we're all being pulled into different directions on what is it that we need to do to survive as an organization, and what does that mean for how we work, and what are the drivers and the levers that people need to pull to help drive those kind of changes. A third one is reconciling this idea of formal culture with informally practiced culture. And some of this has to do with the disconnect between that top-down things such as the core values and the mission statement with the behaviors, the team goals, and the rituals at the kind of the team level, and where we have a disconnect between those two groups. And I know a lot of organizations are also asking then how much variation is acceptable between those groups, and how do we know that? And then number 27% also said pinpointing those tactics, because as we said, we've got groups that have different cultures that have to work together. We are shifting business models or needs to be a digital culture or a continuous improvement culture. And what do we need to do, and what are the levers we pull to help drive that through? And then the last one is very, very relevant based on kind of the pandemic's impact, which is maintaining our culture as we continue to have virtual and dispersed workforce. So as we're disconnected, how do we maintain the culture? How do we go about reinforcing things such as expectations? Because it's a lot more difficult in a virtual environment for a lot of those less tangible culture drivers, right? So how do we go about continuing the rituals that bind us all together? How do we have those informal communications that reinforce behaviors? And how do we also have behavior remodeling when we're not in the same space with people? Now, on the other hand, this also gives us a really good opportunity to reinforce our culture. It gives us an opportunity to help pull up what our values are and use that as a driving force. Now, an example of that is here at APQC, family is one of the big characteristics for our culture. And when we went into lockdown with the pandemic and everybody started working from home, we used that as an opportunity to reinforce that idea of family through other ways. So for example, there was a couple of nights where they decided everybody got to have dinner on the house for the organization to reinforce and help those parents that were struggling with having to do their jobs in a new environment, as well as dealing with children. So reinforce, and also having them be able to spend time with their family. So they were able to do that. At some of the holidays, there was also kind of little activity boxes. I think around Easter, they put activity boxes for people to be able to paint Easter eggs with their children and reinforce that commitment to family, not just within APQC, but also within their own families. So it's kind of an interesting way to see how organizations kind of can leverage their culture in that environment, as well as some of the ways that they feel like it's slipping apart. All right, and that brings us to the second topic, which is sustainability. Now, I think this in particular is a really interesting topic we wanted to explore for a couple of reasons. We've seen a lot of people tout that environment is going to be the next big disruptor for organizations and things that they need to prepare for. I think my favorite phrase along those lines is they're calling it the green swan. Now, a green swan is different from a black swan because there's some certainty around it. We understand that climate change risks are going to materialize. So it's not an unknown, but it is something that is looming and very disruptive. Another reason why sustainability is so important is because I think we just got the report recently, which is the 2021 World Economic Forum on Global Risk Reports identifies environment as some of the biggest risk factors for organizations and prosperity globally. Pardon me. 4 of the 5 top likely risk factors are environmental in nature. And the 5th one is of course, looking at infectious disease, which is a social. And then if you look at the ones that have the biggest impact, 3 of the 4 are environmental in nature. So environmental impacts are huge things and are the biggest next disruptor for a lot of organizations and how we work. So we wanted to explore this idea of sustainability and its impact on organizations. So we asked organizations some questions about that. The first one we did, and given the fact that it's such a high potential risk for organizations, is that 61% of the respondents said yes, sustainability is actually part of our 2021 strategic plans. Again, like I said, with those huge factors of environmental risk, climate change, biodiversity issues, as well as human, I think my favorite one was looking at things like extreme weather also. It's very, very important for us to have plans on how it's going to impact our business and prepare for them. So along those lines, then we also really wanted to kind of dig in and understand what about sustainability is really being driven in your organization. So what's the important factors? And a lot of these are kind of very traditional if you look at sustainability. Environment, again, it's a big issue. It's not just a business individual issue. So it's also affecting a lot of our customers. A lot of people want to be environmentally aware. So some of the big drivers behind that are very linked to that for the organization. A little less on the risk aspect and a little bit more on the opportunity. It's a great opportunity. Corporate social responsibility has always been connected with improved corporate reputation. People like to purchase from responsible businesses. It's a great opportunity for new growth opportunities, places for us to improve our products or identify new places we can place our IP, our products, or our services. It's a potential for cost reductions because it looks at a lot of reduction of waste as well. It's a great place for people to look for that. Green investment opportunities is something that I think has been around since the 80s, but it's really growing, especially if you look at the ESG movement, people wanting to invest in green products or organizations that have a very green footprint. And finally, it also helps us improve productivity. Again, because we're looking at sustainability, we're able to look at things that are going to improve cycle times, things that are going to improve cost efficiencies and reduce waste. So overall, those are kind of the big findings that we found from the survey. Just as far as a few key takeaways, a lot of the challenges are steady from 2020. Some of this is because they're big, pervasive challenges. Some of it is because 2020 also kind of put a pause button on some of our goals and our budgets and our projects, and we had to reprioritize. So some things are coming back. But overall, end-to-end is still a huge thing for organizations, and it continues to grow in its importance. When we're looking at the idea of governance, we've made some progress, but we really need to kind of double down on that strategic aspect of governance and making it more holistic and pervasive in the business. Continuous improvement and a lot of other culture changes are still very, very vital. And very, very important for us as far as engaging people to help provide them to kind of do some of this work. I think my favorite quote from a case study guy was, in BPM, our job is to put ourselves out of work. And by that, he meant that is by getting people excited and getting people doing the work and learning how to do it themselves. But also we're still fraught by a lack of structure in a lot of things that we do, from measures to improvements. And so we still have a lot of ad hoc. Business silos also are kind of plaguing the work that we do. And I still feel that we need to really look at measures before we can get analytics right, because we need that foundational element so that we make sure that we're not putting garbage in to our analytics systems. And again, really that emphasis then, that process needs to really take a stance and look and make sure that its processes or its measures are still fit for purpose and that they have the right measures and mix to be able to do their jobs effectively. And finally, culture is king, and it is going to be pervasive in everything that we do moving forward. So, all right, I think I may have, nope. All right, so then that last piece is what to expect. Sorry, I got my slide out of order in my head. We've got a lot of exciting work coming up this year. We're going to continue working on how process programs stack up. So that is that BPM programs focus. We've got some case studies coming, as well as looking at continuous improvement cultures, looking at teams that support strategic initiatives and things along those lines. We're going to continue to work on the end-to-end process maps and measures. We're going to update the ones that we have so far, and we're going to be looking to developing some more this year, a lot of them around strategy, manufacturing, logistics. I think we're also looking at considering lead to contract or lead to order. So this should be some exciting stuff there. We're looking at that foundational elements of measurement. So here's some tips, here's some work to help, get people started as they're looking at identifying their process measures and trying to get their measurement systems in order. I'm doing a project with our knowledge management team, and what we're really going to be doing is looking at overall productivity and looking at the components of knowledge and process management organizations and how they're supporting that. So our goal is to kind of look at how KM and process management impact and affect productivity in the organizations, which we can also always wind up using as a great way to have a business case for both of those programs. And then we're also going to be looking at a couple of our other projects that we do every once in a while, and looking at this idea of agility and flexibility and how it interlinks with our strategic planning process. And then we're going to be doing our biannual work on process frameworks. So how are people using them? What are the best practices? And some more case studies. So that is a lot of great stuff to look forward to this year. So I'm excited. And do we have any questions, Madison?
Yes, Holly, we do. We've gotten quite a bit. So just to the audience, if you do have any questions as we continue, feel free to submit them through the Q&A panel and we'll get to them shortly. We'll start with someone asked, how many organizations participated in the annual study?
There were 219 respondents to the survey this year.
Awesome, thank you. And let's see, then how do you define process ownership? Is it owning the strategy and design, or the strategy, design, and execution of the process?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I know we've got a formal definition for the process owner, but the process owner is the person who is accountable and responsible for it. So they are not necessarily the person who has to build it. They will typically work with their stewards and their SMEs and their process teams to build it out. but their job is to make sure that it doesn't return to chaos, that they're keeping an eye on it to make sure there's no deviations. A lot of times we see owners will have a very specific cycle for assessing compliance around their processes and the performance of their processes through measures to identify when things do need to change, or if, and on a kind of a regular cycle. And then they have typically groups underneath them, like I said, stewards, or people who are more in the SME level and more at that finite level. I've got a great piece on common process rules that I'll make sure to include in the link here, and it does the full definition for owners as well as the rest of the typical rules.
Great, thank you. And then she also asked, do you have examples of companies that have successfully proven the value of BPM?
We do have some great case studies. I think my favorite is an old one from about 2015. It's Elevations Credit Union. They had some great ROI on their BPM. Number one is the whole purpose, their big hairy goal for doing BPM was to win the Baldrige. And then a couple of years after they launched that program in 2014, they actually won it. But they also were able to track and identify revenue for how they were able to increase the overall revenue the organization got because of the BPM work and the standardization work that they did. So that's one of my favorites as far as that goes. And then some of the other case studies, they'll talk about cost savings as far as that goes. Some groups just measure by satisfaction levels. So most of our case studies do have some form of value and how they're able to establish that value and get it, or results of value, sorry.
Perfect, and I can follow up and then send her that case study. Next question is talking about leadership in your criteria. Who has established the values of the KPI, the manager or the employee?
All right. Are we talking about like the identification of picking the right measures?
I don't have any other comments, so we'll go with that. He said the goals.
Okay. So picking the goals, honestly, it needs to be in the long run a decision made by management, usually senior leaders, and you have measures for your specific area as far as the goals go. What we've seen work really well though is to include some of your next step down people into the conversation. So they may have ultimate right of choosing what the right measures and the goals are. But having that open conversation helps with the buy-in, as well as being able to potentially posit new goals or new measures that you need to use. And that's typically what we see.
Okay. In your research, did you associate the challenges of BPM with the culture change? And her example is process ownership or proving the value.
We have not yet. So some of the correlation analysis I'm running between some of these have to do with some of those cuts. So looking at culture and some of the culture responses with some of these challenges as well. So I've got some extra data cuts I'm doing. One of the questions in the survey we didn't talk about was looking at culture type. So there's 4 typical culture types. So we're going to run some of the analysis against those as well and see where those match. So that's a TBD. And we should have some articles out on that in February.
Okay. And then our next is a comment and question. I noticed the percentage relative to the drivers of sustainability presented were different than the report distributed. Which is accurate, or what are the differences?
It should be the report distribution. I will take a check on that and make sure that they're aligned. Okay. So the report was the one, yeah, it should be the report. It may have been an error when we were doing this part. So I will get that fixed.
Do you know, the next question, do you know how many small businesses participated in the study?
I do.
Less than 500 employees?
I do. So that's another data analytics that I'm doing right now. If you give me 1 second, I can look up the exact number.
Okay.
All right. So we have another data cut that's going back, that's going to look at it into 3 buckets, which is small, which is under 100 FTEs, medium, which is 199 FTEs, and then large, that's over 1,000 FTEs. And for the small category, we had 48 participants in the survey, 51 in that medium category, and then 118 in the large. So you'll be able to then take a look at the challenges and the rest of the information by those buckets. And again, that should be published hopefully at the beginning of February.
Okay. And then can you tell us a couple of companies that are considered best in class in continuous improvement?
Yeah, I've got a couple of them that I like. I think there's a couple of really great case study examples we got. One of them is probably my favorite is UPS. I think they do a great job. Especially the case study we did with them really looks at how they went about developing that process thinking approach, right? So how do they go about with their training and all of that to kind of teach fan to fish and build that thought leadership, that mindset into there. So they're great. Collins Aerospace was also another one that we did a really good job on. And a lot of their focus when we see with the continuous improvement groups is that focus on training and employee engagement and a lot of the work they do. So one of the things we're going to look at is that from the business process management is looking at that continuous improvement set. And we've got a couple other case studies. I can't name names until they get signed off that are also supporting that are some pretty good examples.
Okay. Have you done much work on the consequences of non-compliance of the process measures?
We have not done as much. One of the topic areas we are going to be covering this year is looking at process performance. And so I'm working with our advisory services team to do a series of blogs, some podcasts, and some roundtables looking at specific topics. And that idea of compliance, control points, and measures is one that we're going to be doing mid-year. We plan on doing, like I said, at least one roundtable on it as well, and look for some additional examples.
Okay. Next question, does APQC provide templates and tools to its members to apply the great amount of knowledge and best practices in business process management and knowledge management?
Short answer, yes. It depends on the specifics because it's a really broad category. Short answer, yeah, we have a lot of templates and tools for a lot of these things for process management.
We'll have someone follow up with you on this
Yeah.
question. And then, do you think KM efforts should be part of the process management?
So I think they're best friends. I think one without the other it tends to struggle. Process provides a lot of great structure and foundation for KM work. And then KM provides a lot of great things that make process work actionable. So we've got a couple of projects we've done that look at the relationship between those two. And like one of them is what we did on managing project knowledge. Lauren Trees and I also did a project looking at the intersection of knowledge, data, and process last year, and looking how those groups should play together because they're all kind of focused on the same thing. So yes, and well, there's an emphatic yes.
Does APQC have guidance on building a business case for purchasing a process management software system?
We do not have anything. We tend to be a little technology vendor agnostic as far as building the business case. We don't have that. We do have some stuff looking at selection criteria and things for you to consider. One of our tenets, though, is 7 tenets are these kind of pillars and how we look at BPM. One of them is tools and technology. So while we don't have stuff specifically on the business case, we do have things about considerations for your technology for BPM and the rest of it as well.
Okay. To what extent is the business architecture adopted by organizations?
Oh, that's another kind of broad, tricky question. It depends, I guess, is a question. A lot of the times it depends on where your process work comes in, right? So is it the organization that's focused on enterprise architecture, and is it in the IT? So if you have a lot of work successfully linking it to technology projects, you can see a lot of uptake. Again, part of that depends on the organization's culture and why it goes into it. So varying degrees.
Okay. How do you assess process management in an organization which is in business for more than a century? What improvement opportunities could be identified there?
Um, Again, I think that depends on the organization. We do a lot of work on assessments and looking at, like I said, around those 7 tenets, I think are a great place to start, because it helps you understand what are the levers in your organization that are doing well and which ones you may need to improve. Um, there's a lot of different things. And one of the issues, like the UPS example, I think is a great one. They've been in place for ages. They've had a huge history of process. But a lot of it was with their customer facing groups. So even though they had a culture of process, they knew they needed to revitalize it because it wasn't as permeated into their support functions. And it wasn't doing the job that it used to do. So they had to take a step back and completely reassess how they were doing process work. They did a lot of customer voice, had some conversations to find out where their gaps were, where there was miscommunication. So even if the organization's been around for 100 years, it may need to just take a step back and make sure it's still doing the process means the same thing it did when it started.
Great, thank you. We are at time for today's webinar, and we did receive a lot of questions, so I will get with Holly and we will get those answered and get back to you. Thank you all for joining our webinar. Holly, do you want to talk to the next slide?
I can real quick. All right. Ooh, oversteps. So me and technology are not the best friends. So we do have a lot of next steps. All the stuff I talked about, the links for the research that was brought up, you can find here, so you can check out additional information. We'll have more coming around from the priority survey as well as that BPM program stack up. You can stay up to date on our research agenda. And if you have any success stories that you want to share or experiences you'd like to share, we always learn best from each other. Please feel free to contact me, and I'd love to have a conversation with you guys. Right.
Great, thank you everyone. Thank you, Holly. If you haven't already, check out our process and performance management expertise page and connect with us on social to keep up with the latest. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you all.